morning again, everyone. We are continuing on in our Genesis series. So we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 23. There's a portion of Genesis chapter 22 that we have not covered, which is from verses 18 till the end. And those verses just help to set us up for the story that's going to come in Genesis chapter 24 when it comes time to seeing how marriages take place and where these characters are coming from. So that gives you a little bit of insight into that. But for the time being, we will focus our attention on Genesis chapter 23. Shall we begin? I'll read from verse 1. Sarah lived 127 years. This was the length of Sarah's life. And Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abram went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Abraham rose up from beside his dead and said to the Hittites, I am a stranger and an alien residing among you. Give me property among you for buying a place so that I may bury my dead out of my sight. The Hittites answered Abraham, Hear us, my lord, you are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our burial places. None of us will withhold from you any burial ground for burying your dead. Abraham rose and bowed to the Hittites, the people of the land. He said to them, If you are willing that I should buy my dead that I shall bury my dead out of my sight, hear me, and entreat for me Ephron, son of Zohar, so that he may give to me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns. It is at the end of his field. For the full price, let him give it to me in your presence as a possession for a burying place. Now Ephron was sitting among the Hittites, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the hearing of the Hittites, of all who went into the gate of the city. No, my lord, hear me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. In the presence of my people, I give it to you. Bury your dead. Then Abraham bowed down before the people of the land. He said to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, If you will only listen to me, I will give you the price of the field. Accept it from me so that I may bury my dead there. Ephron answered Abraham, My lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead. Abraham agreed with Ephron, and Abraham weighed out for Ephron the silver that he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weights current among the merchants. So the field of Ephron in Machpelah, which was to the east of Mamre, the field with the cave that was in it, and all the trees that were in the field throughout its whole area was passed to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the Hittites, in the presence of all who went in at the gate of the city. After this, Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of the field of Machpelah, facing Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. The field and the cave that is in it passed from the Hittites into Abraham's possession as a burying place. This is not the complete end of the story of Sarah. She, in fact, shows up as we recount her life later on. Most specifically, we'll hear about her in 2 Peter chapter 3. But not much is said about Sarah to this point. We have Sarah getting married. We have a promise being told to Sarah. We have a name change for Sarah. We have a skirmish between Sarah and Hagar. Finally, she gives birth. They have the child, and 37 years later, she dies. And we don't hear about what happened to the story of Sarah in between giving birth to Isaac, or at least from the time where she convinces Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away. That's the last we hear of Sarah. From that time till now, we don't know much about what Sarah would have been up to. We notice that the Bible oftentimes does not talk about all the details of a person's life, and there are large gaps sometimes found in stories. Perhaps the most noticeable gap that we have in the life of a prominent character in the Bible is in the life of Jesus, when he shows up at age 12 in the temple, and then the next thing we know is he's getting baptized in his 30s. So there's a big gap that happened there as well. So the Bible isn't interested in detailing all of the historical facts that have taken place. The Bible in this way is not a comprehensive history book. The Bible prioritizes conveying a grand narrative, a story from beginning to end. And for the sake of that story, it uses parts of the lives of different biblical characters to bring out certain aspects of that grand story. And so perhaps this is what we have going on here. Well, we have Sarah, who, interestingly enough, is the only woman in the Bible whose age is mentioned upon her death. You know that the Bible is heavily centered around the point of view from the men. Though there are prominent women in the Bible, none of them are given the kind of prominence that Sarah is given. When it comes to, this is something that I've heard, I haven't had a chance to double check it, but as far as I can recall, there is no woman who is set forth for us as an example to follow than Sarah. Not even Mary is given to us as an example to follow, though of course in sermons we do analyze aspects of her life that are admirable, that we do want to imbibe. But it's only Peter in his letter in 1 Peter chapter 3, where he talks about the kind of beauty that women need to have that's not external, but it's like Sarah's beauty that was internal. And so, of course, Sarah, as you remember, was known as a woman who was beautiful even in her old age, but she was much more than that. She was someone who had an inward beauty, an inward, appreciation of the things of God that made her so pleasing to God. Now, this idea of having a woman of such character, and in the Jewish faith, she's considered as the mother of Israel even. And so here we have an interesting promise that was given to Abraham and, by extension to Sarah, that they would have a child, and that they would have innumerable descendants, and that they would have a land that is their own. But of those promises, the part regarding the land, which in some regards may have been the most easiest of the promises to fulfill, because in fact, Abraham is in that land now, but he doesn't own any. It's interesting that it's only after the death of Sarah does the promise actually start to take shape. And it's only after the death of Sarah that Abraham actually becomes a landowner in this promised land. So till now, he has been just a foreigner in the promised land. In the beginning of the chapter, we see how Abraham mourns over the loss of Sarah. The word that's used there for mourn in Hebrew, this is the first occurrence of this word that we have in the Bible. Weeping has happened before in the scripture. As you recall, Hagar was weeping over her predicament. But this isn't, that word is in fact the second word that's used in this context Abraham was mourning and weeping. And mourning is a word that's used to describe the when you lose a loved one. And it's a deep response. There, in those days, it was quite customary for the process of grieving to be a lengthy one, but also to be one that involved certain specific kinds of cultural nuances. For example, it was quite likely that, especially when these two words are used together, that Abraham mourned and wept, that he would have probably gone through the process of ripping his clothes, of shaving his beard, of messing up his hair and throwing sand on his dust on his head, and to go into a period of fasting. We're not given much insight into all of those things. We're just given insight into the fact that he would have loved Sarah so much that he would have gone into this natural state of mourning. And with all that Abraham has gone through up to this point, leaving his homeland, enduring what would have felt like a delayed promise from God, having to send away his firstborn Ishmael, almost sacrificing Isaac, and now the loss of his wife. After going through all of these things, I think though his situation might seem different, we share a lot of common points with the experiences of Abraham. And one of those common points is simply this: life does not always go the way you expected it. Christians are not exempt from pain. We're not exempt from sorrow in this world. Abraham's grief on its own would be enough. It would be more than what what you would wish for on a person. But it goes much deeper than that, because the pain that he would have been experiencing would have been not only for the loss of his beloved, but also in the back of his mind, he would have been wondering how his understanding of what God was speaking to him matched with what he is going through at that point in his life. God had promised to give him the land, and yet he's in the very place that he's supposed to be. And he doesn't gain the land. Instead, he ends up losing the one he loved the most, his wife. And we might believe that one can hold on to hope and promises for only so long. But here we see that Abraham does not let go of hope, that Abraham does not let go of the promises that God had for him. Though yet again it feels like God is delaying in his promise to grant him, the fulfillment of what he had said in Genesis chapter 17. Nonetheless, Abraham proceeds forward in trust. See, normally the practice then, and we've seen it even now, the practice is that when a loved one dies, the hope is that you would be able to bury them in your homeland. So many times if an individual passes here, they will take the body back to India, for example. In Abraham's case, the ideal sort of scenario, because he doesn't own the land and he's just a foreigner in this place, is to take his beloved back to his homeland and bury her there. Now, at this point in time, perhaps it's plausible that the Egyptians were doing the act of embalming. And when you embalm a body, you can then transport it long distances. And in fact, Joseph and Jacob end up getting embalmed, and Jacob's remains were brought to this very place where Sarah is buried. So we know that this kind of transportation could have taken place, but maybe it wasn't an option for Abraham. But then are we to think that this narrative, the way that it flows, that he is looking for a place to bury his beloved only because he is simply accepting the fate that has come his way? I think there's more to it than that. I think the very way in which he goes about burying his wife shows that he is instead declaring his faith, that he recognizes that God has called him to be here, and that it is not a failed promise and that he need not return. Here, I think we see in his conversations the way that he is able to face the situation with an unshakable conviction that the promise of God is worth holding on to. And normally, in times of stress and duress, times of struggle, we will naturally question or start to evaluate our life. Am I on the right path? Maybe we shouldn't have come this way. Or maybe it wasn't meant for me. Or maybe I just wasn't called to do this in the first place. But we don't see that with Abraham. It appears that after a period of genuine mourning, he seems to fortify his resolve to be here in this land. So remember back in Genesis chapter 17, verse 8, the verse goes like this. Also, I give to you and your descendants after you the land in which you are a stranger, all the land of Canaan, as an everlasting possession. Now that word, possession, it's a word that is sometimes translated as property. It's sometimes translated as inheritance. In the New Testament, when we look at which Greek words were used that coincide with the Hebrew words from the Septuagint, for example, we find that even in the New Testament times, when they talk about inheritance, that stems from this Hebrew word. And it's not a word that's used too often. God said, I will give you something, and it will be yours forever, an everlasting possession. That this everlasting possession was part of the promise, and it would be something that would remain with Abraham and his family. The word for possession that's used here is the same word that's used in verse 4 when Abraham requests for property to bury Sarah. It's almost as if, and many scholars have pointed this out, because of the rarity of this word, it's as if the author of this Genesis story is trying to get us to link what Abraham is doing now to his trust in the promise that had been said by God. And so basically, here we find Abraham is staking his claim in the place that he is dwelling as a foreigner, but he is staking his claim and saying that this is going to be a perpetual property that ends up being not only the place where he lays Sarah to rest, but it will be the place that Abraham is buried. It will be the place that Isaac is buried, that Rebekah is buried, that Leah is buried, and that even Jacob is buried in. And so you see that even to this day in Israel, you can go and they have this area marked as the place of the burial site of the patriarchs. Later on in the story, as we read, Abraham describes himself as a foreigner, and he appeals to the landowners there, to the Hittites, and asks to buy a piece of land to bury his wife. And it's a very delicate exchange that happens here. Some of the delicacies, like it takes some time to unearth them, and we're not going to get into all the nuances of Hittite law that give a lot of insight into why Ephron would instead offer up more of his land. He would offer up the whole parcel of his land rather than a small portion of it. So there's a lot of different things that are feeding into the context of this dialogue. But let's simplify it down and let's look at simply what's happening, and I'll give some insight as we go. Abraham is asking for a place, a property to bury his wife. And the Hittites are very kind, and they of course do not refuse. But then again, they're not agreeing either, because if you read carefully, Abraham was requesting a place for him to bury his wife, and they instead offered a place for him amongst their own burial sites. And so they said, sure, why don't you bury your beloved or bury your dead in any of our, or in the choicest of our burial site. So this actually isn't what he had requested. And they call him as a mighty prince in contrast to how he refers to himself as a foreigner. And they assume that since he is like them, that he ought to bury his dead in the same places that they do. But it seems that here we get an interesting theological lesson here, that in life and in death, there seems to be a set apartness that Abraham has in mind. And it's not necessarily to be thought of in geographical terms, but in terms of how one ought to live life and how one views the promises of God. Abraham is distinguishing himself from the Hittite people, not in where he is, but in how he is. He refers to himself as a foreigner, they refer to him as a mighty prince. And again, here we see that he sets himself apart in his humility by bowing down each time he speaks to them. I think this is what sets him apart. So rather than making use of borrowed property to bury his beloved, he held firm that God had promised a perpetual place for him. And so he had set in his heart to buy a plot of land. And after now a quick exchange of dialogue with Ephron, Ephron offers Abraham not only a cave where he can bury, which would have been a tomb where he could bury Sarah, but also the entire field. But there's no price listed. Now, without a price, and there is a definite intentional ambiguity in the Hebrew here, because the same word for give can also be translated as to sell. And so we're not sure if he's giving the land or if he's selling it, and he's not stated a price. And so what that means is, without a price, we can only assume that it is either a loan or it would be used as a kind of debt, but not as a perpetual property. Now, apparently this is a typical negotiation strategy. And you don't have to go to the Middle East to experience this. Anytime you call for an auto rickshaw in Kerala, especially. In other places, they're a little bit more diligent about turning the meter on. But in some places, there is this kind of back and forth negotiation. And I recall once after landing at the train station, the bus station in Kottayam, I wanted to just get to the other side of Kottayam to the seminary. You find an auto rickshaw, you call them, you ask them, can they take you to this location? Sure, I can take you, come. Then you ask how much? And they said, don't worry, just come. You know that there's some catch to it, and so you ask, no, really, how much? And they said, well, in my situation, they recognize that I'm not from here. So they say only 50 rupees to take you there. That's nothing for you. And then you're kind of stuck in this awkward situation of it's quite embarrassing to say that I can't afford it, but then I don't want to pay that high price either. And this is a sort of kind of scenario that takes place between Abraham and Ephron. Ephron had no intention of just handing over property, a plot of land to a foreigner. The intention was always to sell it. And this is why then you see he goes and sells it for a price of 400 shekels. Now, some scholars say that this is an exorbitant price. Others say that we're not quite sure if we can say if it's a good deal or not. But regardless of if it's a bargain or not, the point is this from Abraham's perspective. He was able to make a public transaction open in front of everyone, and he was able to acquire the land on his own, so that now everyone knows that this land belongs to him and to his generations after him. So what does this mean for us? Because remember, there's so many events that could have been recorded that aren't recorded. What is this narrative telling us? So I think one of the things that it tells us is that promises are to be held on to and not to be abandoned. Abraham would certainly have felt like he's being beaten down at this point. but he does not give up in trusting in God. When we read Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8, it goes like this. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out for a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. It's that same word again. And he set out, not knowing where to go. By faith, he stayed for a time in the land he had been promised, as in a foreign land living in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Abraham was able to recognize that though the promise was vast, and though he couldn't see how it would be possible that he would step forward in faith and do what is possible in his end, which is everyone's God-given responsibility. See, we all are going through unprecedented times right now. The communities that we live in, they're all going through struggles, and not only the communities, like individually as families, there are different struggles that we are all facing. How do we face these challenges? Well, first, we can understand that there is a place for mourning, there is a place for weeping, but we do not lose hope, we do not lose heart, and we don't let these losses in life keep us from continuing to trust in God. And to some extent, in the grand story, our lives are quite similar to Abraham and to Sarah. In life and in death, we are to be set apart for God. Abraham followed God in life and saw that even beyond his physical life, he could recognize that there is a kingdom being built, that the promises of God are being made manifest, and that God's not sitting around ignorant of what's happening. God is at work. He was working to bring about the fulfillment of these promises, and the perpetual property that Abraham buys, it's not the fulfillment of the promise. I think Abraham understands that, but it's an expression of his faith, that he trusts that God called him to be here. And so he pays a price, perhaps a very high price, in order to declare that he trusts that God knows what is best for him, and that he can rely on God more than he relies on the world and the offers that they give to him. Sometimes we may experience the joys of promises fulfilled, like Abraham and Sarah did when they had Isaac. But sometimes we have to just cling on to the promises that are still off in the distance. And so whether it's grief or injustice, or whether through depression, sometimes we too might have to pay a price in order to declare our faith that God is still in control. And if you think about it, then in the grand narrative, there is one who does pay this price and who does receive the everlasting possession. But the everlasting possession that's received is not property, because when Jesus pays the price, he claims you and me for himself as an everlasting possession that he holds on to, and it remains with him forever. Let's close with Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13 to 16. They confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on the earth. For people who speak in this way, make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they are thinking of the land that they left behind, then they would have opportunity to return. But as it is, they desired a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, he has prepared a city for them. No matter what we are going through, no matter what experience of mourning or weeping we are facing, know that the promises, whether they are being fully experienced now or whether they're off in the distance, they are still worth holding on to. We may not see progress as quickly as we would like, but nonetheless, let us pay a price to express the faith that we have, that God really is in control, and that really his possessions will always be his. So may the good Lord strengthen us to lead such a bold life, even as we are foreigners in this world. Amen.